All right, let's get started. Sorry, it's been quite a week, so I'm a little scattered. Take me a second to get my feet under me. Welcome to the Bodgery's laser cutter certification class. You do not need to be a member of the Bodgery to take this class, but you do need to be a member to use the laser cutter itself. If you need to refer to any of the materials that we use for this class, you can go to our webpage, scroll down to the bottom. There is a link to our wiki. The wiki looks like this. There's an equipment's tutorials page. On the equipment's tutorials page, there is a link to the laser cutter. And then on the laser cutter are the handout that we're going to be using, some video series, a link to the laser cutter software so you can install it on your own machine, and some information about the laser cutter itself. This is the handout that, oops, not that handout. This is the handout that we'll be using for the class. We do have two laser cutters in the shop. We have a smaller 50-watt laser cutter that is about 12 inches by 20 inches. And we have a larger 130-watt laser that's about almost 36 inches by 51 inches. The bigger machine, because it's more powerful, is also faster for the same cuts because you can run it about 3 times as fast as you would on the little machine. But where the little machine shines is Z depth. It has a lot more travel on the Z axis, so you can put thicker objects in it. You can't cut objects as thick as you can fit in the machine, but you can engrave them. So things like engraving the top of a wooden box of some sort. That's a little bit trickier on the big machine. You got to get creative. On the little machine, the bed just lowers down 12 inches so you can fit things underneath the laser. The other perk of the smaller laser that doesn't get a whole lot of use, but is handy when you need it, is it has a rotary bed so that you can put cylindrical objects in the laser cutter. Things like, wine glasses, wine bottles. Just make sure that they're empty before you put them in the machine. On the back of this handout is a cheat sheet for do's and don'ts with materials. One of the most common questions that we get is, can I cut X on the laser cutter? This is not an all-inclusive list, but it is these are the materials that are used the vast majority of the time. Woods, especially hardwoods, my favorite thing to cut in the laser cutter is solid maple. It's beautiful when it comes out of the laser cutter. But any other wood works. Probably the most common thing that gets cut on a laser cutter is birch plywood. Boards, things like chipboards, mat boards, cardboard, paper, fabric, especially natural fibers. Some synthetic fibers are not so good, but just about anything natural is. Leather, suede. When it comes to synthetics, the second most common thing to cut on laser cutters is acrylic/plexiglass. These machines do also handle Mylar as long as it's not overly reflective. Vellum, EVA foam. Any questions so far? Okay. So there are certain materials that can be used with the laser, but they have restrictions associated with them. A very common one that we get asked about is metal. Neither of these laser cutters will cut metal. They're not the right kind of laser cutter to do metal cutting. Normally you'd use a fiber laser for that. These are CO2 lasers. Some specially outfitted CO2 lasers can cut metal, but neither of these are outfitted like that. By the same token, neither of these machines will directly mark a piece of metal. You can't etch or engrave into the metal either. However, here's where the asterisk comes in. If you have a piece of metal that is already treated, say anodized aluminum, you can use the laser cutters to etch away the anodizing and leave the bare aluminum behind. And that is actually a very effective technique. We've used it to make like commemorative award plaques in the past. If you have a piece of bare metal, then you can purchase a spray-on marking fluid. The most common are Ceremark and Thermark. Basically what you do is you spray them onto the metal, you let the spray dry, then you run a very high-powered engraving pass on the laser cutter, and it will bond the microceramics in the spray to the metal itself and leave a very durable mark behind. It tends to range somewhere between black and dark brown in color, depending on which version of Thermark you buy. But you either need metal that is already marked, or excuse me, already coated so that you can remove the coating, or you need to purchase a spray-on coating for marking bare metals. Glass can be etched very well on the laser cutters. It cannot be cut. If you try to cut glass on the laser, then it will shatter. And when you're etching glass on the laser, there's still a chance that it'll shatter. So no family heirlooms, nothing like that. No full bottles of liquid. And rubber, there's a very specific laser safe rubber. Rubber is not toxic or anything when you run it through the laser, but it's extremely smoky and can melt or burn. There's a laser safe rubber that's normally used for making either gaskets or stamps. Laser engraved stamps work very, very well as long as you purchase the rubber that is specifically for that purpose. On to things that you absolutely cannot cut. So things that are extremely reflective, there's an asterisk here because if it's reflective only on one side, then you can invert your image and cut from the back. So something like Mylar that's only reflective on one side, you could flip it and cut from the non-reflective side. Soft foams, things like packing materials, tend not to do well, though there are some purpose-made laser cutting packing foams. Gels, things that have a high liquid content, food, magnet sheet, styrofoam, fiberglass, carbon fiber. Any plastic other than acrylic or plexiglass automatically starts out in the prohibited column. But if we take a look at the material safety sheet and see what kind of, what it off-gasses when it's cut with a laser, the products of combustion, so to speak, some things can be moved over to approved column, but generally if you don't see it there, you have to ask first. Polycarbonate, ABS, PVC, and vinyl. Those are all bolded because they give off highly toxic gases when you cut them with a laser. Polycarbonate, PVC, and vinyl all off-gas some form of chlorine. And ABS off-gasses generally a type of cyanide. So neither of those are good things for you or the machine. So never any of those. It can be difficult to distinguish between plexiglass / acrylic and polycarbonate. If you are not sure, if you found what you think is acrylic next to the dumpster and you're going to use it, always run a very small test piece first, just a 1/4 inch square, and watch what happens. Acrylic will cut very nicely, leaves a clean edge. It doesn't smoke overly much. Polycarbonate will give off a thick brownish yellow smoke and it'll start to scorch instead of cut. Immediately stop what you're doing if you see any kind of thick off-color smoke coming out of the laser cutter. Any questions about materials? Any utterance to let me know you're still there?
Yeah, we're all here.
Awesome.
Hello.
Thank you.
James, I have a question.
Go for it.
Are there limits to the thickness of the materials you can put in there? For like, you were talking about putting maple in, it was really nice. Is there a limit to how thick the maple can be?
It depends on whether you want to cut it or engrave it. If you want to cut it, then pretty much every material is going to top out right around 5/8. Once you get above 5/8, you're starting to get into the, single-digit speed territories and possibly even multiple passes. The problem isn't really so much a question of power, it's a question of optics. If you picture the beam coming out of the lens is very hourglass shaped. I'm exaggerating that shape here. Only that middle part where it's highly focused is able to do any cutting. So if your thickness starts to get too far outside of that usable focus area, then you start scorching more than you're burning. Your power is just not concentrated enough. So with the big machine, that's right around 5/8. With the smaller machine, you're starting to get into dangerous territory at 3/8-ish. That would be pushing it on the smaller machine. Honestly, both of these machines are in their comfort zone in the 1/8 to 1/4 inch range. Those, they both do pretty good job cutting, especially the big machine. It can run through 1/4 inch material all day long. One side note thing that we've picked up here, if you are interested in cutting thicker materials, especially when we're talking about wood, one thing that we have done here with pretty good success is grab some 1/4 inch acrylic or plywood of some sort, cut it out on the big machine, and then use a flush cut router to cut your thicker material using the laser cutter as a template generator. Any other questions? All right then, moving on to, let's talk about laser cutting in general as a process. If you've done any kind of graphics work before, then you are on your way to being a laser cutter. If you have not, I promise you it is not that difficult. Lori or Lois, do you have a question?
No.
Okay. I just saw your square light up. So at its heart, everything that you do on the laser cutter is going to come down to a graphic design of some sort. So you're going to need at least 2 pieces of software. The first one you're going to need is some sort of a graphic design package. And the other thing that you need is something to drive the laser cutter itself. The piece to drive the laser cutter itself is easy for these machines because currently we only use 1 piece of software for that. We are investigating another piece of software, but it's not free. So it's, The software we normally use is free, therefore everyone has access to it. The other software is not free, so that puts some limitations on it. When it comes to the graphics, the design side though, then you have a lot more choice. By far, the two most popular choices are Illustrator and Inkscape. For the same reasons that I spoke to a moment ago, we're going to be using Inkscape for this class and demonstration because Inkscape is free and it runs on nearly everything. Illustrator is also extremely popular, but it is the exact opposite of free. So if you have access and you know how to use it, feel free. In fact, I recommend it if you have access because of one or two very specific quirks about the free workflow that we're going to use today. But in general, using the Inkscape pipeline will get you 99% of the way to what you can get from the Illustrator pipeline. Another common one is Corel Draw. So if you're used to using Corel, go right ahead. The other side of the coin, folks that are already versed in CAD, you can continue to use your CAD software. Anything that will spit out a DXF file will work with our lasers. And if your CAD software won't spit out a DXF, might I recommend you look into some different CAD software. So let's talk about graphics themselves. There are generally, this chair is short. There are generally two different kinds of graphics software, or at least two different kinds of graphics that you're gonna run into on your day-to-day moving around this world. There are raster graphics and there are vector graphics. Raster graphics are the things that you're probably most familiar with. The photos people send you via text, those are rasters. Things you see floating around on the internet, 99% of the time, those are rasters. Rasters are grids of colored pixels, blue, green, red, blue, green, red, and they're put together into those grids to make up images. Vectors are things, they tend to be used for more stylized drawings and representations as opposed to photographs. And instead of being grids of colored pixels, vectors are mathematical constructs. They are collections of points and lines and curves. And you can use both of those graphics types with your work with the laser cutters. But they have different uses and pros and cons. So starting with rasters, if you're using a raster for your design and you don't intend to convert it to a vector, then that raster can only be engraved in the laser cutters. You cannot use a raster image to define a cut in the laser cutter software. The best you can do is just cut the rectangle that bounds it. When you feed the laser cutter a raster image, you can have the laser software try to do most of the work for you. So let's say you've got a photo of your dog and you want to engrave it on a sign for his doghouse. You pick a nice photo of your dog, something with high contrast, convert it to grayscale, take the color information out of it, and you can just give that directly to the laser cutter software. And you can also tell the laser cutter software two numbers, technically three. One is speed, how fast should the laser be moving back and forth, and then the highest power to use and the lowest power to use. So I might give the laser software a photo of my dog and say, run this at 300 millimeters per second, and I want you to use 80% power and 20% power. What the laser software will try to do is find the darkest dark places in your image, dog's nose, background, whatever, and set those areas of the image to the highest power you gave it. And then it'll find the brightest areas of the image, you know, clouds, fur, and set that to the lowest power you gave it. And then everything in between, it will just smoothly map between those two powers. And what that will try to do on materials, say, white birch, the more power you pump into white birch, the darker it burns. So by varying the power between minimum and maximum, between the lightest and darkest areas on the image, the laser cutter software will do its best to take that grayscale image and burn it onto a piece of material. You can also tell it to invert. So instead of putting the highest power to the darkest dark, it'll put the highest power to the lightest light. The reason you might want to do that is if you're burning onto acrylic or plexiglass. Plexiglass is the opposite of white birch. It tends to get brighter the more energy you dump into it, more and more white. But that is basically all you can do with a raster image for the laser cutter. Give it the image and 3 numbers. And then it will try to work things out on its own. With a vector image, on the other hand, you can both cut and engrave. Because a vector is made up of individual components, individual pieces, you can assign different operations to different parts of a vector. So you can cut and engrave the same vector image. So that's kind of the trade-off. On the one hand, with a raster, the workflow is technically simplified because you just give an image and 3 numbers. With a vector, you've got a lot more work to do, assigning individual speeds and powers to individual pieces of your image, but you get more control. So you've got that trade-off. Vectors do also tend to be a little more stylized or simplistic. You lose a lot of fine-grained detail, but the laser cutter burning into a piece of wood is also going to lose some of that fine-grained detail. So again, it's a trade-off. What we are going to do today is work with some vector images, because that gives you the most versatility, and it's not called a laser cutter for nothing. So we're going to want to do some laser cutting today. So let's start with our software. While I'm prepping this, any questions about anything so far? All right. This is Inkscape. Like I said, this is a free program. Search for it in Google, you'll find it, and it almost certainly works with your machine, or at least some version of it will. Along the left-hand side, we've got some tools, selection arrow, node editor, rectangles, ellipses, polygons, curves, Beziers, text, eraser, you name it. Across the bottom, there's a color palette. Across the top are some more tools and measurements. These two allow for precise positioning. These two allow for width and height sizing. You can also change what units you're working on. It is important to note, though, that changing your units does not change anything about your design. If you've got a 5-inch rectangle and you change from inches to millimeters, that rectangle still measures 5 inches. It's now displayed in millimeters. Also, between the width and height is a little lock. If you're trying to scale something without getting the aspect ratio out of whack, you can click the little lock icon, scale one dimension, and it will automatically scale the other so that everything stays in sync. Let us talk about how we design. So, kind of 3 ways you can go about this. You can go directly to certain places on the internet and find ready to cut laser cutter patterns that are freely available to use, or that are commercial and you have to pay for. And you can grab those designs and use them out of the box without barely having to do any work at all. On the other hand, you can start with a blank canvas and design from scratch, ground up, all your own. Or you can do something in the middle where you find something that's close to what you want and modify it till it fits your needs. That's what we're going to do today. So let's start with, I need an idea, something that we're going to cut today. Any suggestions? A noun? All right, then it's going to be rockets. So here are some images of rockets. Let's pause for a moment. These are all raster images. They are all grids of pixels. Some of these might be decent candidates to engrave onto something. Let's see, does anything jump out at me? Here's a pretty good one. This might be a good candidate for converting to grayscale and just engraving directly onto an image. You've got, first of all, not a huge color palette. You've got a dark blue, a slightly lighter blue, orange, white, black, and that's it. The laser cutter doesn't give you color. So if you've got something with a whole ton of different colors, when you convert it down to grayscale, a light green is going to look a whole lot like a light red. So you're going to lose a lot of your contrast. Something that starts out with just a few primary colors tends to work better. The other thing is those primary colors all have very good contrast between them. Really? You know, we've got a bright white against a dark blue, orange against blue. All of this stands out. So the laser is not going to have a hard time recreating that on a piece of wood. Same with this one down here, as long as you don't care about this extra stuff. On the other hand, something like this, bright white against slightly oranger white, this white on the edge here against the white of the sky. This shock cone is the same color as parts of the nose cone itself. You're just going to get muddy if you try to send this to the laser cutter and say, do your best. So if you are trying to use a raster, it's important to try to find something with some high contrast.
So, excuse me, are we talking about then making sure that we have higher values, like a mixture of values between more intense and less intense that are like not, the steps are larger, if you will? So
the larger steps would be better, yes. Another thing is grayscale images are 256 levels of gray. That's the standard count. On a material like white birch, you're not going to get 256 tonal variances when you start burning that birch. At most, you're going to have about 10 to play with. The subtleties get lost when you're burning into wood. So I would try to stick with things that have at most 9 or so discrete tonal values.
that answers my question.
And almost as important is placement. You know, if I have got something that's very close to white here and something that's slightly different white there, that's a lot worse than tone 1 of white and then a big expanse of dark and then tone 2 of white. At the end of the day, they're going to look the same, but it won't matter because they've got something between them. So the separation of the tones is important too. For example, this guy, there's really only 3 colors here, white, black, and orange, but it's white on white So you're going to lose something. So let's then move on to something that's easy to convert to a vector. First thing I'm going to do is go to Tools, and I'm going to change the type to line drawing. A, that tends to move me directly to black and white, which for vectors is great. B, it tends to give me things that are a little more stylized, which again is better for vectors. Let's see. This, when you see images with a checkerboard background, that means that they're usually either PNG or SVG. SVGs are great because they're already vectors. You can just use them as is. But for the purposes of this class, I'm going to use something that isn't already a vector. Another thing I want to point out is this usage rights drop down. This will let you select a license under which you're willing to operate. So this is commercial and other licenses. This is Creative Commons. Creative Commons is a fairly permissive license. So we're not going to be doing anything commercial today, so we're going to go with this design. I think, yes. I don't want to hear anything about my desktop. All right, so we've got our image. Let's go pull that into Inkscape. I selected import because I'm going to import a file into this project. I will point out, we're going to be vectorizing this image. So you want to start with something that's got a reasonable amount of resolution on it. I will say, if you are chatting to me, I might not see it. So
I was chatting quick because Marty wanted to know how to turn his volume on.
okay.
So I just told him that you gotta hover across the mouse on the bottom left corner and it might say mute and just unmute it. Unless, I think that might be his problem. I don't know.
You all good, Marty? Well, all right, so here we are in Inkscape. Oh, what I was saying is I wouldn't use anything with, unless you're going for a very tiny image anyway, try to stick with things that are at least 300 pixels in both directions. This one's a little shy of that, but not enough to really worry. So here is our rocket in Inkscape. So earlier I said that vectors are mathematical constructs of lines and curves and points. In Inkscape, those are referred to as paths. So most of what we're going to be doing today in Inkscape, if it's in a menu, it's in the path menu. In this case, I've got my rocket selected, and I'm going to select from the path menu, Trace Bitmap. That will give you a dialog box for Trace Bitmap. I will tell you, if you're working with a black and white line drawing, these default values have never failed me. If you're trying to vectorize something that's not black and white, that's maybe grayscale, you might need to use grays down at the bottom. The difference is what we're about to do now, this software will try to draw a line anywhere it sees a sharp contrast value change. So anywhere that black meets white, it's going to try to, sorry, I said contrast, I meant brightness. It's going to draw a line there. If I had grayscale with more gradients, you know, dark gray, lighter, lighter, white, grays at the bottom will try to draw multiple lines. Same thing with brightness steps with the number of scans. It'll try to break those things up so that you could then, in the laser software, directly assign a darker gray, a lighter gray, a lighter gray, a lighter gray. So things at the top will try to give you one line, things at the bottom will try to give you multiple. We're going to use these default settings and hit OK. We get a little preview. Looks good to me. So I'm going to just close this and nothing happened, except now we have two. Earlier, I mentioned the pros and cons of rasters versus vectors when it comes to laser cutting. Rasters, you can only engrave. Vectors, you can do both. There's another difference that comes into play. Vectors are infinitely scalable, whereas rasters have a set resolution. I could make this rocket bigger and bigger and bigger until my computer runs out of memory, and it won't make any difference to how sharp it is. Whereas this raster, on the other hand, is already blurry to the point of unusability. So we're going to get rid of the raster. It has served its purpose, and now we have our vector. So technically, we have something that we could send to the laser cutter, and we could theoretically tell it to cut this. At this point, it probably wouldn't go as well as we would hope, but we could do it. So let's keep going, though. We want more control. As of now, this is all one piece. Let's say that I wanted to make some changes to this design to make it more in line with what I'm looking for. What we need to do is take this one big path and break it down into multiple smaller paths. The way that we do that is up in the path menu again. But before we do that, there's one thing that I personally like to do. It just makes things a little bit easier. It makes things a little bit easier to see. With our design selected down at the bottom in the color palette, I'm going to right-click way over here on the bottom left, second from the left, there's a black square. If you right-click on that square, you can select Set Stroke. All that does is say, hey, make sure all of my lines are black. Next to that is a white square with a red X in it. If you hover over it, it says None. If I right-click on that and select Set Fill, that just says if you've filled in any flat parts of this design, take that fill out. Doing that, we can see something that was hidden a moment before. What looked like just a thick black outer line is actually two lines with a black fill between them. That's what I meant earlier when I said if you tried to cut this on the laser cutter, it might not do exactly what you think, because the laser software does not see fill. It doesn't care whether or not a shape is filled in. I could fill this rectangle in and it would make zero impact on what the laser cutter does with this design. So by removing that fill, we remove something that to me is a little misleading. Now that we've removed the fill, we can go up to the path menu with our rocket still selected and select break apart. And that'll do exactly what it sounds like. It'll break this into multiple smaller pieces. You can see now we've got multiple selection boxes. I can select this rectangle on its own. I could fill it in, I could delete it. The reason that I also like to remove any fill before I do break apart is the way Inkscape defines what should be filled in or not has to do with closed shapes. Earlier, this outer border, because all of this was one piece, was a closed shape. When we break things apart, each of these individual pieces is a closed shape. So if you don't remove fill before you do break apart, your image has a tendency to turn all black. In fact, I can show you. This is what happens if you don't remove fill before you do break apart. Gets a little bit harder to select things. All right. So let's say that I don't like quite so many of these circular designs. Now that I've got individual pieces, I can delete that one if I want to. Going even further, if we move to our node selection tool and select one of these paths, you can see that now we have little handles at key points around the design. By manipulating these handles, we can change the shape of the piece. So, for example, let's say these two side legs on the rocket are very pointed because we're looking at them edge on, but this front one isn't pointed. And theoretically, that makes sense in the design of this thing, but let's just say that I want something a little more balanced. I want this one to be pointed too. Now that we've got our node selection tool selected, we can start, I can select this node and just press delete to delete it. Do the same on the other side. Then I can select this middle one, come up to the top and say, make selected node a corner. Now that node is a corner. I can grab the nodes at the end of this piece and pull them up. I can grab these two corner nodes here and use these handles to further manipulate the design. I can keep going with the ones I want to delete to get rid of those little corners altogether. You get what I'm showing here. Again, we could keep going and do the same for this inner piece. I might say that it doesn't even make sense for that to be there because we're looking at the edge. So, any questions so far about manipulating a design? I'm going to do a couple more things to further this piece for when we get it to the laser cutter. First thing I'm going to do is put a border around it just so that we have something to cut out. I have to move I keep having to move the zoom window around because it's in the way. That looks good. Another common thing that we need to do is put text on our design. So let's say we want this rocket to say NASA. And that's not how that goes. Over
Hey,
on the,
James,
yes.
can you show one more time what you did to center your border around the rocket ship? It looked like you clicked something that automatically centered it.
Sure. What I clicked was, so over here on the right, there is a palette of collapsible tools. You can get to these from the menus themselves. The one I'm going to use is called Align and Distribute. I've already got it open, but I'll go ahead and click on this anyway and open it again. These will let you align on different attributes. So this is align left edges, align top edges. What I did was I selected the thing I want to align and the thing I wanted to align it against, which I just picked this portal because it's roughly centered. And then I clicked this center on vertical.
Oh, okay, thank you.
If I wanted to be really strict about it, center it horizontally too, but that's about what I expected would happen. You can also change how it works. Do you want the first thing you select to be the anchor, the last thing you select? So that's what I did there. Align and distribute, very, very handy. Transform is over here too, so if you want to scale or rotate or skew things. Text is over here as well, though that text actually looks fairly decent, so I'll leave that like it is. I do want to center it as well, so we'll go back to Align and Distribute and center it. One thing though, I just added this text, and if I go to the node selection tool and I select any piece of the rocket, you can see I get all these nice handles. If I select the text, I only get the one handle that's just the origin of the text. That's because this is an object, it's not a path. And we want objects for, or excuse me, paths for our design. If we sent this to the laser software, this text wouldn't come through. So what we need to do is convert this object into a path. Again, we're going to go to our path menu and select object path. Now, I've got nodes just like everything else. If I wanted to, I could start manipulating this text as if it was any other set of nodes. You do need to be careful though. Once you convert this to a path, it's no longer text, which means I can't edit it. I can't, if I misspelled NASA, there's no way for me to fix that typo. So make sure your text is in the format you want, roughly the size you want, and everything spelled correctly before you do that object path. Technically, this outer circle or outer ellipse is also an object, just slightly different. If I sent this to the laser cutter, it would probably work, but to be 100% pedantic about it, we probably want to go object path as well. Now you can see I've got all four of these handles. Any question about just very basic design? I mean, obviously we have not even scratched the surface here, but a design class is its own thing. Any questions about just roughly using Inkscape? All right. Now we want to get our design from Inkscape into the laser cutter software. Inkscape's native format is SVG, which is pretty much a de facto vector format. But the laser software that we're currently using does not understand SVGs. We need an intermediate format. The one we're going to use is DXF. So File, Save As. Move you guys again. For the Save As type, we're going to select Desktop Cutting Plotter DXF. That is a very standard CAD format. We'll call it Rocket. Normally, I will say this. Normally, I don't pick File Save As. Actually, let's cancel that real quick. Normally what you would do is save this as an SVG. So in our class folder, We'll save this as rocket.svg. Now, if I need to come back to the SVG and make changes, I've got it saved as an SVG. What I would normally do is save a copy. In our save a copy, we're going to pick DXF, still in our class folder, and hit save. These defaults with both of these unchecked are what you're going to want to use 99.999% of the time. These are leftovers of a bygone age, and we don't really use them much anymore. The base unit is important to take note of, but it doesn't really matter what it is. Even if you've been working in millimeters, this can still be inches. That's not a problem. But you do need to make a note of what unit you're using. So our base unit is in inches, which I think at the moment is, we'll check. We'll go with inches. And as soon as it stopped thinking, we'll have a DXF. The reason that I suggest doing save a copy, when you go save as, it not only saves the DXF, but opens it. So the file that you're in is the DXF. If you make changes, you're not making changes to your base SVG, and DXF is not as full-featured a format as SVG. Save a copy leaves you in the SVG, but puts the DXF on the hard drive. That's where we are now. So now, let's go over to the laser cutter software. This is RDCam version 8.1.26. It is also called RDWorks, and it is less so, but used to be, referred to as LaserWorks. So if you're trying to search for information online, all three of those names are applied to this software: LaserWorks, RDWorks, and RDCam. I do believe RDCam is the official name for it. If you go to help, it says about RDCam. If you click on it, it doesn't really give you a whole lot of help. So this is RDCam. It has an extremely similar layout to Inkscape. I think it took maybe some design cues from Inkscape. You've got a selection tool, a node select tool. You've got rectangles, ellipses, text, mirroring. Down at the bottom, there's another color palette, though this one does something slightly different. Across the top, you've got your positioning and sizing tools. You've got your ratio lock. You've also got alignment tools over here. These are handy for doing last minute tweaks. I will say that if I've got a project where I need, say, a 9-inch square with a 1-inch hole dead center, then I'll skip Inkscape and come directly to this software and just draw my rectangle, draw my ellipse, use the boxes up here to explicitly set the width and height for both of them, use these to center them, and be done with it. Anything more complex than that, you really want to be using a dedicated design software. Go ahead, Drew. Just unmute and ask your question. If you're talking, Drew, you're muted.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
I can hear you, Drew.
Oh, okay. Are you running RDCam on your computer like Inkscape without being connected to the laser?
Yes.
Okay, I could not download it and get it to work.
If you want to talk about it after class, I'll try to help you troubleshoot it.
So sounds good. I'll continue to listen to you, and I'll try to get it loaded. I don't know why I'm having problems with it, but I'll work it out. Thank you then.
Sure. Okay, so like I was saying, for very simple primary shapes, design work, you can do that in the laser cutter software. Anything more complicated than that, I highly recommend using some dedicated graphics package. Also, to go back a moment, if you're using Inkscape, you need to go through that DXF step. If you're using Adobe Illustrator, the laser cutter software understands Illustrator images natively. However, you do need to make sure that in the save dialog for Illustrator, you select Adobe Illustrator 6, or is it 8? Whichever the last one before Creative Cloud came into play. You'll select that format. So to pull in our image, we're going to skip the open menu and go to the import menu again. I'm going to jump down to my class, grab my DXF. Take a moment to look at the preview, make sure my text is there, make sure nothing looks off. Actually, before we do that, we're going to check one other thing. Remember that when I saved that DXF, I saved it with a base unit of inches. I'm going to go to the config menu and click File Para Setting and make sure that DXF unit is set to the same thing. So you can see here, I was using millimeters last, so we'll move this back to inches, hit OK, and go our file import again, choose our rocket, make sure it looks good, and hit open. If I had not done that, then when I open this, my piece would be really tiny. This piece is roughly 8 inches or 6 inches tall, and it would have opened as 6 millimeters instead of 6 inches. If, on the other hand, I'd have saved it as a base unit of millimeters and opened it as inches, then it'd be huge. It'd be 25 times larger. I will say, if precise measurements aren't important, and you've opened something and it's way too big, you open it and it's just filling this much screen, you can just select the whole thing, lock your aspect ratio, and plug in one of your dimensions and just resize it here. However, if you've done the opposite and you've opened your piece and it's extremely tiny, it's generally not a good idea to scale it up. Once you get down to the millimeter level and you have parts that are less than a millimeter apart, the software starts to lose resolution and join pieces that shouldn't be joined together. And if you just scale it back up, those mistakes scale as well. So it's probably a better idea to fix your DXF import units and try it again. So this is our piece. In my copy of the software, I've set this grid up to be 50 millimeters square, so roughly 2 inches. I know this piece is about 6 inches tall, so this looks good. So now it's time to tell the laser what it is that we want to do. So because this is a vector, we've got choices. We've got things we can do to different parts of this. So let's decide what we want to tell the laser to do. First thing we want is we want this oval to be a cut because we want to actually remove our piece from the stock. We don't want to carry around a 12 by 24 inch piece of plywood all day long. What we want is just a little, what is this? Let's call it a Christmas ornament, in which case it needs a hole for some ribbon. There we go. So this is our Christmas ornament. So we want to cut it out. So the way that you tell the laser to do different things to different parts of a design is with this color palette at the bottom. You assign different colors to different pieces. Those colors are technically layers, and each layer can have its own set of instructions for the laser cutter. So this is going to be a cut, this is going to be a cut, and technically what I want, I think, is I want this inner piece of the portal to be a cut so that we can put like a photo of our kid behind it. They're in the rocket riding their ornament on the Christmas tree. So those three are going to be cuts. They're already black, so I will just leave them black. Text tends to be an engraving operation. It's a little more rare to be cutting out letters, but it happens. So I'm going to set them to a different layer. And when it comes to the rest of these pieces, I'm holding Shift right now to select these other parts. I want these to be engraved, but I don't want them to be engraved like the text. I want them to be engraved a different way. So I'm going to set them to a third layer. You'll notice I skipped red, and that's because whenever you select things in this software, normally the selection color is red. So if you also have red parts in your design, it's hard to tell what's selected and what isn't. So I tend to skip red. So here's our piece with all the different layers set out. Over on the top right-hand corner of the software, as I was adding these layers to the image, I was also getting those same layers popping up over on the top right. Now this gives you a very brief overview of how each layer is currently set. You can see this mode. I've got 2 cut layers and a scan layer. I've currently got the black layer selected, and it's showing me for black a minimum power of 90, a maximum power of 90, and a speed of 20. So this is a very brief overview of the instructions for that layer. If I double click on one of those, it opens a layer palette, or excuse me, a layer parameter dialog that allows me to set the more detailed instructions. So over on the left, we've got our different layers. I can cycle through them. This is just which layer you've currently got selected. Is output means when I send this design to the laser cutter, does this layer get sent? Reason you might not want to do that, let's say that I run this piece and everything looks good except this outer design or this outer oval doesn't cut all the way through. Maybe I ran it a little too fast. It didn't have enough oomph to get through at that speed. As long as I don't move anything in the laser, I can run this design again. But I don't want to run my engraving layers again, or they're going to get double engraved, which is A, very slow, and B, probably not what I want, because they're going to be twice as dark, twice as smoky, twice as deep. So I might set the green and blue layers to is output no, and then run just this outer ring again. Well, technically I'd be running all 3 of these, but these 2 getting cut twice isn't the end of the world. Next up is speed. Speed in this software is an absolute value. It is millimeters per second. Technically, I think you can change that to inches per minute, but I really don't recommend it. Millimeters per second. In this case, for this cut layer, I'm going to use 20. I'll talk a little bit more about speed in just a moment. Next up is if blowing. Both of these lasers have what's called an air assist. They both have air pumps attached to them with tubing that runs to the cutting head itself, and they blow a stream of air into the cutting head and out through the same opening that the beam itself exits from. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First, when you're cutting with a laser cutter, you're always going to have smoke of some sort generated. And the air assist tries to keep that smoke away from the bottom of the lens. The lens is extremely transparent to the wavelength of light that makes up this laser, but soot is not. And if soot builds up on the bottom of the lens, it starts to heat up until eventually the lens will crack. And before it cracks, you'll also start losing laser power because you're heating up the lens and not your material. So the air assist tries to keep the lens a little bit cleaner. Also, when we're using a laser cutter, there is some amount of burning going on. You are pumping a lot of heat into flammable material, and some of it is going to burn. But more of it is actually not burning, it's vaporizing. The core of that beam is roughly 8,000 degrees. That's enough to vaporize wood, go right past combustion and straight into evaporation. Wood vapor is extremely flammable. So if you've got a little waft of wood vapor coming up and 8,000 degrees coming down, you're going to get fire. The air assist blows that plume of vaporized materials away before it can ignite, so you don't get fire running around your piece. That is better for your piece, better for the machine. There's also some debate you can look up, people arguing back and forth on forums all day long about, well, if you turn the air assist off, oh, sorry. One thing that's also happening, that vaporized material also recondenses and falls back down onto your piece, and that will give you a slight hazy look. So if you look at this piece, you can see right here and here, there's a brown haze around the engraving. That's because that vaporized material came up, fell back down, and stuck. Some people say, you turn off the air assist, it'll let that stuff drift away before it sticks. And other people say, no, you want the air assist on high so it'll blow it out of the way before it can recondense. They're both wrong. If you want clean pieces, the way to get them is to either let it dry and then sand it, or cover it in masking tape before you cut it and do the engraving and cutting direct through the masking tape. Turning the air assist off is just asking for fire. All that being said, this doesn't actually do anything, because in order for if blowing to make a difference to your part, your laser cutter has to have a solenoid on the air line. Neither of these lasers have that solenoid. So this doesn't actually do anything at the Bodgery. The smaller laser has a switch on the machine marked air that you can turn off. The big laser, you just have to unplug the air pump if you don't want the air running. The only time you should be doing that is if you are cutting material that is so thin that the air assist is blowing it around the machine. So if you're cutting paper, or you're cutting lightweight fabrics, or if you're cutting veneer, you know, that really, really thin veneer, then you can turn the air assist off. And it kind of doesn't matter because the material is so thin, you're not really vaporizing much of it. Fire is much less of a risk then. You should still keep an eye on it because it's less of a risk, not a risk. Just also make sure you turn it back on, plug it back in when you're done, so that the next person doesn't not realize it's not on and set something on fire. Next up is processing mode. So this is where you select between cutting and engraving. Now, I'm going to say that in this class, I tend to switch my language around. I tend to use the words engrave, etch, and scan to all mean the same thing. The laser cutter software calls it scan. So if you're looking to engrave something, you'll want the scan processing mode. This is our black layer, so we want that set on cut, so I'm not going to change it. Dot is a purely artistic choice. What it tries to do is vary gradients by changing the size and power of dots to fill in areas. You could kind of think like Sunday morning comic printing, or old school comic book printing, those tiny little pixel dots, same idea. The best thing I can say about dot is if you're curious, experiment with it. The last one is pen. Some laser cutters have an attachment that will transform the laser on-off signal into a pen up-down signal to turn your laser cutter into a plotter. Neither of these machines have that, so you'll never use pen. We'll set this back to cut. Next up is power. So there are 12 power settings. These different rows labeled 2 through 6, those are for laser cutters that have multiple cutting heads. We don't have multiple cutting heads, so you'll only ever use row 1. The 2 columns are for minimum and maximum power. So earlier we talked about how if you give the machine or this software a raster, you can set a minimum and maximum, and it will decide, or it'll apply a minimum to the whitest white, maximum to the darkest dark, and then pick between those two as it goes. This is where you would set those minimum and maximums. Because this is a full depth cut, where all we care about is getting all the way through the material, I'm going to set both of them to 90. When it comes to cutting, it's a pretty straightforward formula. You want to run the machine as fast as it will go and still cut through your material. And most of the time, because we're usually cutting wood or acrylic, that means setting minimum and maximum power to 90. And you might ask, why not set it to 100? The reason is both of these lasers from the factory are overdriven to, earlier I called the little one a 50 watt. I'm trying to get out of that habit. It's actually a 40 watt. It's been overdriven to 50 watts. The big laser is 130 watt that was from the factory overdriven to 150 watts. By running only up to 90%, we're actually running them to their full power. We're running them to that 130 watts, that 40 watts. Someday, maybe when we have another laser and I'm not worried about taking one out of commission for a few days, we'll go in and reset the power supplies so that 100% is 100%. We don't have to worry about that anymore. So when it comes to cutting, you're normally going to 90 and 90 and then playing with speed until you find a speed that will get through that material just barely. Couple of reasons. A, you pay for the laser cutter by the hour. The faster you can cut, the cheaper it is. B, especially in the summer, both of these machines are water cooled. The little one is passively water cooled. It just has a big reservoir of water that starts to heat up as you cut. The big one is actively water cooled. It has an actual compressor and refrigeration unit to try to keep the water cold. If the water gets hot, or I should say, as the water gets hot, the laser loses power. So because water has such high thermal inertia, if you can get through your cut before the water has a chance to heat up, then you're better off. Lastly, because of the way the machines work, it is easier on the machine to run at full power for 30 seconds than it is to run at half power for a minute, mainly because of the way the coolant heats up. And you ask, okay, so 90 makes sense. How did you come up with 20? Experimenting. Behind the camera on the wall in the laser cutter area is a blue sheet of paper that we've all collaborated on for what settings work with what materials. I see 1/8 inch Baltic birch in the 150 watt, cut 80, speed 20. So isn't quite what I've got here, but close. These other settings on the right, you really don't have to worry about. I try to make sure laser through mode is off. That doesn't really do anything when these are 0, but I try to make sure it's off anyway. This is more useful when you're cutting metal. Briefly, What this would do is, if I set this to say 500 milliseconds, what it would do is when it starts a cut, instead of jumping straight to 90 and 20 millimeters per second, it would sit still for half a second at 50% power instead of 90. That's useful when you're cutting metal and you need a chance to bore all the way through the metal. Earlier I said some CO2 lasers, if they've been specially outfitted, can cut metal. That special outfitting is a high pressure, pure oxygen environment. And this laser through mode gives you a chance to bore through so that that O2 can start blowing slag out the back. If you just start cutting, the first bit of that cut is not going to be blowing slag out the back. It's going to be splashing slag up at the lens. Because we don't cut metal, we don't really have to worry about that. Next up is our engraving layer. So is output yes. So is output is yes. Speed is 300 millimeters per second. If blowing is yes, processing mode is scan because it's engraving. And for this one, I've got it set to 40 and 40. Now, earlier, I said that cutting is a simple equation. It's as high a power as you can manage and as fast a speed as you can manage to just get it done. When it comes to engraving, though, you have, didn't realize that my camera was inverted. You have more choices. This is a much more artistic decision that you need to make. You want something that is very lightly engraved and not very deep. You want a dark engraving that's got some depth to it. And the way that you do that is by varying the speed and the power. And they are, they're related to each other. You can either keep the speed the same and increase the power to get a darker cut, or you can keep the power the same and decrease the speed to get a darker cut. So let's say that you're looking for something like this. Well, these two are basically the same. Technically, all four of these are pretty similar. So which one would we use? Well, we want the one that's got the highest speed. So we're looking down here, high power, high speed. This one is running at 100 millimeters per second, whereas this one's running at 40. So similar output, but this one will cost you less than half as much as this one will. And it'll put less than half as many hours on the laser tube. So for this one, I happen to know, oh, also, I'll point out something. These stay near the laser cutter. They are samples in white Baltic birch, but they were cut on the little laser cutter. If you want to use these numbers on the big laser cutter, all you do is multiply the speed by 3. So if I'm looking for, say, yeah, I'm looking for something right around here. This says 100, so I'm going to make it 300, which is why this says 300. You can all see my camera, right?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Hey, James, I have a question about that piece you just showed us.
Yes.
If we have another, say, of a different type of wood, does that file exist somewhere where I could run the same speed and power test on a different type of wood, or would I just have to recreate it?
This thing is so old that, I mean, this piece of wood is almost 5 years old now. I doubt I could find this file.
Okay.
That was at least a laptop ago. So if you want to run one of these, it would need to, though I do think you can actually download one of these from like Thingiverse and or elsewhere on the web. So you might not have to build it completely from scratch. We do also have this little piece. This was cut on the big laser, so these numbers are just direct. So there's that. A couple other settings over here. Independent output. Let's talk about that one real quick because it can make a huge difference. Let's say that I had this NASA, let's say it's a big piece. I'm working on something that takes up most of the bed. And in the top right-hand corner, I've got, I don't know, a word, speed. And in the top, sorry, completely shattered my train of thought. Top left-hand corner, I got the word speed. Top right-hand corner, I got the word power. Those are, on the big machine, we'll say they're 48 inches apart. If I just run this with independent output off, what the laser will do is scan left and right to do its engraving. And it will start at the top left corner of the word speed, engrave one stripe, and then go all the way across 48 inches to the top left corner of the word power and engrave one stripe, come down a tiny little bit and go all the way back across and do the other one. So all that 48 inches in the middle is wasted space. You're just traveling the laser back and forth without actually cutting anything. Independent output, on the other hand, would do each word on its own, or technically it would do each letter on its own. So it would go do all of the word speed on the left, move over once, and do all of the word power on the right. That can cut your engraving times by more than half, just by getting rid of all that wasted travel time. However, when you've got a word like NASA right here in the middle, you don't want independent output on because you don't want it to do each letter individually, because this thing is going to try to be going 300 millimeters per second to do its engraving pass. It cannot stop and turn on a dime and go back in the other direction. It has to slow down. And once it slows down to a stop, it can't instantly get back up to 300 millimeters per second. It needs room to decelerate and accelerate. So if I'm just engraving this N, there's a zone here where it's just slowing down and speeding up, and a zone here where it's doing the same. And then for the A, and then for the S, and then for the A again. Whereas if I leave independent output off, it'll scan across the entire word, and you just have those two dead zones at the ends. Again, that can cut your engraving time by half. So you kind of have to make a decision when to use independent output and when not to. The other thing, ramp effect. So let's say that I was making this a stamp. So what I'm doing is I'm engraving away everything but what's between these lines, so that I end up with raised text. Stamping rubber is actually fairly soft, so if you picture the end of that N is going to have straight sides. As the laser's engraving, it goes from 0 power to 40 power, and then from 40 power to 0 power with no gap in between. So it's either full on or full off. And that leaves you with an engraving that has very straight sides. If I turn on ramp effect and give it a number of, say, 1/10 of an inch, then what it will do is, oh, and also set this to 10 for the minimum power, then as it gets close to, once it hits 1/10 of an inch away, it'll turn on at 10% power. And then as it goes across that 1/10 of an inch, it ramps up to 40%. So that you end up with sloped sides instead of straight sides. It gives you a buttressing effect, and it reinforces that text that you're leaving for your stamp. That's a very specific use case, but it also gives an interesting artistic effect. You know, it gives something of a just more gentle slopes, more geometric, and it can also be useful to do inlays. So normally you don't want exactly straight sides for inlays. You want them to be angled and then sand them or plane them flush. So let's turn ramp effect off and set this back to 40. Last little bit over here is scan mode. There are 4 values for scan mode: X unilateralism, X swing, Y unilateralism, and Y swing. So X and Y are simple. That's just, does it scan this way or does it scan this way? Unilateralism versus swing. Unilateralism will scan in one direction, turn the laser off, move all the way back, turn the laser, and then etch in the same direction. So it's only etching in one direction, and the other direction is just a movement. Swing etches in both directions. So swing should be twice as fast as unilateralism. Unilateralism can theoretically give you a slightly more polished engraving. So that's trade-off. You have to ask if it's worth it for you. Now, X versus Y, though, is actually very important. Let's go back to actually a real example. A gentleman came in with a piece of plexiglass. He was going to cut a sword blade out of it and engrave the entire blade. The idea being he was going to put some LEDs in it, and the engraving just diffuses the light. Originally, we started without even thinking, it was in Y swing, and the blade was this way. So that means that it was engraving like this. Again, you've got that dead zone on both sides of the blade all the way down. We calculated it was going to take about an hour and 20 minutes to do the entire thing. We stopped it, moved down a little bit on the piece, started it again in X swing, and it finished the whole thing in 15 minutes. That's how much of a difference getting the direction of your engraving can make. So if you've got something that is long in one dimension, you probably want your engraving also in that dimension. The other reason you might change it is if you want your engraving to line up with the grain of the wood that you're using. It can make a very slight difference. In this case, we'll go with X. And that's it for our text. We've got 300 millimeters per second, 40% power from minimum and maximum. Moving on to the green layer. Now, what I want for the green layer is when we engrave this NASA text, let's go ahead and make this an engraving. This is easier to demonstrate than it is to tell. So right now, I've got one cut for black, and then green and blue are both engravings. This button here is probably the most important reason to install this software on your machine. This is the preview button. This will show you what the laser is going to try to do. So if I run this, you'll see this is the design we currently have. The color of this green actually makes a difference. This is the laser software's way of telling you how much power you're dumping into that particular cut. The darker the green, the more energy that piece of material is going to see. You can see our engraving is a much lighter green because it's running a lot faster at a lower power. So this might actually be okay. This might be what you're looking for. But for the purposes of this class, this is not what I'm looking for. What I want is something a lot more subtle. I don't want to fill in these lines. I want to just draw the lines that make up the rocket. Maybe I'm going to put some acrylic paint on it when I'm done. So let's close this preview. Let's go back into our layer parameters, go to our green layer, and instead of scan, I'm going to make it cut. So what's happening now is the laser thinks it's cutting probably all the way through the material. But instead of running at 20 millimeters per second, I'm running at 300 millimeters per second. Instead of running at 90% power, I'm running at 10 and 40. So there's no way this is going to cut through. It's just going to mark the surface. So if we jump out here to the preview, now we see this. This is actually what I'm looking for. So we're going to use a cut to do an engraving layer. One other important thing is you'll notice I don't have 40 for minimum. For this layer, I've got 10 for minimum. And the reason is this. If we go back down here to this point that I made, this laser is going to be running 300 millimeters per second when it gets to this corner. It can't make that corner that fast. So somewhere up here, it's going to start slowing down. It's going to slow down into the corner, and then it's going to start speeding up out of the corner. So it's going to be running slower through this part of the design. If I said use 40 for minimum and 40 for maximum, it's going to use 40 the whole way, even as it slows down. So this cut or engraving is going to get deeper and deeper as it goes into the corner. And normally with a sharp corner like this, it actually burns all the way through. If you hold it up to the light, you'll see little pinpricks of light coming through. By telling it it can use between 10 and 40, then for most of this design, it's going to be running 40 millimeters per second, or excuse me, 40% power until it gets to the corners where it's going to drop down to 10. So we should get a much more consistent line throughout our design. And we've already gone through the rest of the settings for cut. So any questions about the layer parameters, about cutting and engraving settings? Because frankly, this is the part that makes it a laser cutter class. You know, the design work you do in your graphics software, that's up to you and your graphics software. Importing a file into this is just click import. This is where the meat of it comes in. What was that?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'm thinking about why some content is on the blue layer and some is on the green. And I guess ideally, if you knew ahead of time you wanted to change the depth of that cut or one of those parameters, you would choose to put it on its own layer.
Correct.
So I was trying to think, like, why and when would you put things on their own layers?
It's so you can give them different settings.
Yeah, I mean, be able to give them different settings. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
In fact, I do want to make one change. So I'll show you the preview again. Notice these two circles. I actually don't want those two circles to look like that. I'm going to select those and I'm going to make them blue. I'm going to reselect the middle one and make it black. And I'll do the same preview. This is why I put them on a different layer. So I could have the difference between this kind of engraving and this kind of engraving. So that's our piece. Our preview looks good. This is what I want to give to the laser cutter. Let's see, I need to make one quick move here. Can everybody see this camera? So I'm moving my laptop over to the laser. I'm just pulling the USB cable out of the computer here at the laser cutter and plugging it into my machine. If you are going to use the laser cutter for any volume of work, I highly recommend that you bring your own laptop. There is a machine here at the shop, but the last person that used the machine may use different settings than you're used to. They may use inches instead of millimeters. They may decide to use black for engraving instead of for cutting. You never know. So by bringing your own laptop or working at home and just bringing the file on a USB stick, you don't have to worry about other people changing settings. So I plugged my laptop in. And so I'm going to switch to my other camera now. There's another person in the Zoom meeting named James, and you should be able to see me on that screen. Is anyone not seeing that?
We can see your hand.
Good. So this is the big laser cutter. Before we always want to open the lid and make sure of a couple things. Make sure that it's empty. Make sure no one's left a big hunk of metal in it.
Oh, hold on.
Yeah?
I can't see the laser cutter.
You can't?
James, is
No.
there any way you can make
Oh, I
your
see it.
other account the presenter so that people automatically get switched to that camera?
You know, I've never actually done that.
Oh, I got it. You have to hit pin video.
Well, as long as you guys can see it, you should be able to expand that video out to fit your needs.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, so we want to make sure that the laser cutter is empty, and we want to make sure this is the cutting head. We want to make sure that the cutting head is above the level of this table. There is a scenario where the laser head can be all the way in the back, and this vector grid can be out here on the floor, or even in here. Sometimes people take the vector grid out to get more Z depth available to them, and that means they lower the head down, they put it all the way in the back, they put the vector grid back in, but now the laser cutting head is lower than the level of this table. You turn the machine on like that, you risk snapping off the head. So always make sure the machine is empty and the head is above the table. So,
I'm sorry, how do I can't see the laser printer?
what do you mean by that?
I see you, and I'm still
Gotta
looking at your
switch.
rocket drawing.
The participant you're viewing to, I think it's called Go James. So if you go to the little preview window in the corner, there's a grid, a like 3x3 grid. Click.
I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking for. I see what you were doing on the drawing. I see you, but there's nothing else on my screen.
So now that I've stopped sharing, you see the grid of participants?
Yeah.
One of them should have the laser cutter in it.
No. Keystone? What?
Nope.
That's me.
James.
It should
Go James.
No, I'm Go James. It's just James.
Or
Yeah.
sorry, James. You got to hit the arrow keys to find it.
You may have to scroll through the list of participants.
Okay. And it's called?
James.
Okay.
You see it?
So did that help at all? So I've spotlighted James, so he should be showing for everyone. All right, I'm gonna have to move on. And we'll work it out after the class if you have any questions. I'll try to be extra descriptive with my language. On the right-hand side of the machine, there are a set of controls. There is a green switch marked laser. There is a red switch marked lamp, and a USB port at the top and another USB port at the bottom. We want to make sure that lamp is on and that laser is off. Then on top of the machine, there are 3 control sets. There's the e-stop, the main on-off switch, and the control panel. So because I know the laser is off, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the main switch. Machine will power up. And I'm going to put this back on the tripod so you don't have to watch my hands. So I'm actually going to turn this off, put it back on one more time so you can see why it's important to make sure that the machine is empty. First thing the machine does is it goes to its home location, which is in the top right corner of the machine. It presses 2 switches there to make sure it knows where it is, and then it goes back to its last origin. That last origin could be anywhere in the machine. I will also point out that when you turn on the machine, some noise starts around the machine too. On the right-hand side, down here, is the powered chiller. So that is the refrigerated unit that keeps the water cool. Behind the machine, in this vertical pipe, is an exhaust fan that goes out the window. So, and there's also the air pump that starts. This is the tube for the air assist. It's blowing out the bottom there. So let's load our file into the laser itself. So I'm going to share again for a moment. So here is the laser software. Down at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, there is a download button. After you've connected to the laser and it's on, you can click the download button. You give the file a name. We'll call this Rocket. In this case, there's already a file there called Rocket. It's probably mine, so I'm going to say yes, override it. It says success, so we click OK. And at this point, we no longer need the software itself. Everything we need is on the laser. So I could disconnect, put my laptop away, and go to town cutting Christmas ornaments for all my family. So I'm going to stop sharing again. And move back over to the laser cutter. But first, I'm going to turn the fan off just so it's a little easier to talk. Okay, so now we've got the laser cutter on, our file is in it. Let's grab some stock. So I've got a piece of stock here. I'm gonna lay that down. I'll point out underneath the table. That stock is free. That's a scrap bin. If you've got a useful piece of scrap, you can put it there so other people can use it. Over here, there is another stock pile, but some of this is free and some of it is not. It's marked on the wall. Nope, leave it alone. Free, feel free. So now we want to focus our laser. The way that we do that is I'm going to put my piece of stock underneath the laser head. Pick you guys up again. I apologize for the shaking. Here on the laser cutter, on a magnet, is a piece of acrylic. This is your focusing tool. The way that you use this is come down into the laser cutter itself. You lay that focusing tool sideways on your material, you pass it underneath the laser head. It should just touch as it passes underneath. So in this case, it doesn't quite make it. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to grasp the laser head down here at the bottom and just lift. It's just friction fit, so it should just slide up. Now it just barely passes underneath. So now we're focused. Any questions about that? I will also point out there is a small red targeting laser right here. This targeting laser is a suggestion. It is not entirely accurate. This metal bracket, I have to bend it into shape when people bump it. And it's hard to bend it perfectly so that that lines up. So never trust this. If you're trying to cut a 24-inch piece of, a 24-inch circle out of a 24-inch square of wood, this might hurt you. So always be cognizant that that's not perfect. So we're focused. I'm going to put this back so it doesn't go missing. I'm going to move my piece so that I'm roughly in the corner. I could also use these arrow keys to drive the laser head around. However, sometimes it's easier to move the piece to the laser than it is to move the laser to the piece. This is scrap, so I don't care, but if I was cutting out of nice material, I might use the arrow keys to help me find square. I don't think this piece itself is square, so it's not going to help me much, but what I could do is put that little, let me turn this light off, put that little targeting laser on the edge of the wood, and then run it down and see if it stays on the edge. Slipped off a little bit, so I'll readjust. And then go back the other way. Again, doesn't really matter for this piece. But if you're running on maple or something else expensive, it might. So now we're lined up. So back to the control panel. What I'm going to do is first press the File button. Once I do that, I get a menu with everything that's, all the files that have been transferred to the laser. If you've just transferred a file, it will automatically select it. We've got a little preview of our rocket. I apologize for the glare. So I've got the rocket selected. I'm going to press Enter. Now we get a larger preview of our file. We also get the layers in the file, and these are hard to see on the video, but it's also showing me the speed and the maximum power. So I get a rough idea of what this file is. The next thing I'm going to press is Origin. Origin just says, hey, this is where I want you to cut from. In the laser cutter software, when you select a piece, there's a little green square. In fact, let me share real quick. So this little green square here, this is your origin point in the software. So when I say cut, this is going to cut to the right and down. So by pressing the origin point, or by pressing the origin button, what I'm saying is that spot right there should line up with that green square. So we pressed origin. Next up, I'm going to press frame. And what frame does is frame tells the laser to draw a frame around my piece. This will allow me to see whether I'm going to cut off the material, whether my design fits. So I'm going to press frame now. You can see that my design fits on the piece, so we're good to go there. So we've focused, we've selected our file, we've set the origin, and we've hit frame to make sure we're not going to go off. The only thing left to do is to press the start button. Before I do that, I'm going to close the lid of the laser, and I'm going to use the green switch to arm the laser. You should never have the laser armed while the lid is open, because it will fire. So far, there's only been one person dumb enough to get in front of this laser. And it was one of the most painful things I've ever done. So don't be like me. Closed. So laser is now armed. We've got our file loaded. We're focused. The origin is set. So all I'm going to do is press the start button. So the first thing it's going to do is do the engraving pass. That's the window outline. Next up, it's going to do the NASA text. Now it's going to do the cuts. And that beep means that it's done. So I'm going to turn the laser power back off. I've left main power on. I'm going to open the lid, and this part is important. At this moment, I don't know whether that cut all the way through or not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press down very firmly on one corner so that nothing can move. I'm just going to lift up on the other corner, see if my part is loose. It's actually not quite loose, so I could back away slowly, go turn off my green and blue layer by setting is output to no, and just run that outer cut again. In this case, it's close enough so that I can just pop out the little piece that's not finished.
Hey, James. James, when you mentioned turning the blue and green layers off, can you do that from the machine, or do you have to do that from your computer?
So that one you need to go back to your computer for. I suppose if you really didn't want to pull your computer back out, what you can do, and I'll grab the other camera for this, is with a file selected, you can press the Enter key, and you can see now it's highlighted the layers. I could go to the blue layer and hit Enter, And now I can change the speed and minimum and maximum power from here. The way that you do that, by the way, to go from row to row, you have to hit this ZU button. So I press ZU down to minimum power, and then I can use left and right and up and down to change the values. So I could set this to 0. Actually, I can't set it. I can set it to 0.1, which is the same thing as 0, and then run it again. But it would still do all of the movements. It would still go through the motions. So I'd probably save time in the long run just by going back to my software and downloading it again. I'm gonna hit escape because I don't want to actually make that change. Let me just run through a couple of things real quick here. When you're done, so this design has this little bit here that gets cut off. This is big enough so that it will sit on top of the honeycomb that's in this bed. So anything that's still sitting on top of the honeycomb, make sure you pick it out. Some things are just the right size to get down in the honeycomb, but not go all the way through. Knock those out with grab a pencil or something and knock those pieces through. If you've got a piece of wood stuck in the honeycomb and someone else makes a cut on top of that, then that bottom piece of wood is protected from the air assist and it can catch on fire underneath this piece. So make sure you don't have any little cutoff pieces stuck in the vector grid. Also, when you're done, if you've lowered the laser head any significant amount, make sure you put it back up. Make sure the reason these copper blocks are here is if you've got a piece of wood that's warped or twisted, you can use these to kind of weigh it down to get rid of some of the warp. If you do, make sure they're not in any of your cutting paths. You don't want the laser cutter to run into these. And if you have used them, make sure you take them out when you're done. When you're done, clean it out, close the lid, make sure that the green switch is off. You can leave the red switch on, it's just the light. And then turn the power off.
Hey, James?
Yeah.
If I have a fibrous gasket material that has some curvature and I need to weigh it down, like say, obviously outside the frame area, as long as my weight is lower than the height of that laser focusing gauge, am I okay?
If it's outside of the framing area?
Yes.
Yeah, just make sure that it's not high enough that it'll hit any part of the laser head.
Right, so as long as it's outside the frame area and below the focusing depth gauge, I should be good.
Yes. I will say one thing though, if you're trying to weigh down stretchy materials like a gasket material might be, try to just lay them out. Don't try to smooth them flat. Sometimes a material can stretch and then grab hold of the vector grid. So it's on tension. When you cut a piece out, that tension tends to release and then pieces move and you get a bad cut.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
One other thing I didn't show you, but right here in the upper left corner of the screen is a countdown clock or a count off clock. When you're paying for laser cutter time, that timer is all you're paying for. You're not paying for time spent at the computer. You're not paying for time spent focusing and getting everything ready. You're only paying for the time that the laser is actively cutting. It doesn't remember from one part to the next, so keep a log. It's an honor system. It doesn't have to be perfect. You know, if you round 27 minutes down to 26 or something, fine. When you're done, there is a black box on the wall there. That's where the bees go. That is the blue sheet of paper with all of the times or speeds and powers we figured out. Any questions?
Yeah, I missed the step to get the file onto the laser cutter. So you put your USB in the port, and then do you have to click something on the monitor there?
So I've just plugged my laptop into the laser cutter via the USB cable. And in the laser cutter software, can you see the software again?
Yep.
This download button is what I clicked to actually move the file to the laser.
Okay. And if you just have it on a USB, then do you just select it on the screen on the cutter itself?
So if you're going to use a direct USB stick on the laser cutter itself, there's one more step you need to go to. So let me show you one thing real quick. This is a project in the laser cutter software. So we imported a DXF, but the laser software doesn't natively use DXF. It's got its own format. So if I go save as in my class folder, the native format is RLD. So I might call this rocket.rld. If I was going to open this project to work on it later, I wouldn't use import, I'd just use open. And there's my rocket RLD. However, if you're going to put a file directly on the USB stick to plug directly into the laser, you need to use this save to U file, and it saves an RD file. That is basically G code for this machine.
Okay.
You would save this RD, then plug it into the USB port on the machine, not the one that the computer is plugged into, the one labeled USB. And then in the menu, instead of picking the just waiting a moment while the system resets. So stop sharing. So right up here at the top left next to the word idle, that's the clock. And so if I press file, it goes to the file list automatically, but right here, you can see it says UDisk. You would just use the arrow keys to come over to UDisk, and that's how you would choose something from the USB stick.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Also,
And then,
have a file on here. There's also a copy to UDisk at the bottom that will move a file from the machine to the USB stick.
Okay. Then my other question, kind of unrelated. Where do you buy stock, like the maple stock you referenced?
So I get maple at Woodcraft by Pier, what is it, Pier 57 down in Monroe.
Yep.
I also tend to buy my birch plywood there as well. If you just need a quick small sheet, you can pick up birch plywood like 12 by 24 at Menards. For acrylic, I go to Midland Plastic, which is right across the street from the Menards in Monona.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, yes. I guess, James, you were talking about not knowing if you cut all the way through.
Yes.
So if you haven't cut all the way through, you just run those cut lines again?
Yes, as long as you don't move the piece.
Right. So in your experience, say with your birch plywood at 90% level, at what thickness do you need, have you found that you need to rerun those cut lines?
I'm not gonna lie, if I've got thickness that I cannot get through in one pass, I don't cut that on the laser. It is not worth running multiple passes on the laser cutter to me.
That's what I want to know. Okay.
Normally there's usually a piece of wood over here that someone's tried multiple passes on. I mean, you can make it work to a certain extent. I mean, because of the optics that we talked about earlier, there is a limit. You can't just, oh, I'm going to cut a 2x4 in half. I'll just run it 9 times. It doesn't work.
Right. Yeah.
And if when you run multiple passes, you tend to get so much charring around the edge that it's not a nice cut. Any other questions?
Yeah, James, I have a question about different materials.
Okay.
Like the, I'm calling it a bed, the thing that you put your piece of wood on, for example, in the laser cutter. You set that piece of wood in there and maybe say it's a 1/4 inch thick. Well, what about if you put a piece of fabric down? It's just like a piece of, you know, canvas. Is there like a vacuum suction or something that holds that really nice in place and so straight that your laser cutter does a good job of cutting your logo out of it? Or what's the method that's holding those materials down tight so the laser cutter works well?
So there's actually a tiny bit of suction because the laser cutter is trying to draw air out to clear the smoke. But, you know, it's not a whole lot of air movement, and it only works really if you've got a large portion of the bed covered. So there is some suction. You know, if you're cutting something very light, like I've cut tulle in the laser cutter, and it doesn't get more lightweight than tulle.
Yeah, that's pretty flimsy.
Yeah, and that worked fine. I used it to cut, you know, circles for wedding bird seed or whatever.
Yeah. So how did that, I'm just kind of trying to picture, like I've cut, you know, you cut fabric on a cutting table and it moves all over the place. So how does that fabric stay in place to do, you know, to work with the laser cutting equipment?
Cut fabric on a fabric table or cutting table, you're touching the fabric. You're running the scissors through it. Nothing's touching the fabric in here. That's light. It's not an actual blade. So there's nothing putting force on the fabric to make it move.
I see. So therefore it doesn't want to move.
Right.
Huh. Okay. Well, really interesting.
Cancel spotlight. Okay, there we go.
Hi. Along those same lines, concerning fabric, can you cut multiple layers?
You can. I've cut also some felt on the laser cutter, and cutting up to 3 or 4 layers of felt at a time was not a problem. Tulle was a little bit iffy because tulle has some spring, you know, the creases give it some spring. If you are cutting multiple layers, you want to make sure that they're relatively thin and that they're flat together. You don't want gaps between them.
Thank you.
So feel free to stick around and ask any questions that you might have. I believe I've recorded everyone's name that was here for the class. So at this point, you're all certified and ready to go. So you don't have to stick around anymore if you've got other things to do. But if you do have questions, feel free.
I do have an additional question.
Go for it.
When files are transferred from the computer to the cutter, do they remain? In other words, can other people access that file?
By default, yes, they remain. You can delete them. There's the menu that I showed you earlier when we were talking about the U-Disk. I showed you can go to the right and then down that little list on the right-hand side. One of those is delete. So if you've got something proprietary that you don't want on the machine, you can delete it when you're done.
Thank you again.
Yeah. There is a limit to what will fit on the machine. There's technically 2 limits. There's the internal storage, and there's a hard number of 99 designs. So sometimes you might try to send a file to the laser cutter and it says it fails. Normally that's because it's full one way or the other. Either there's a few really big designs that have just taken up all the memory, or there's 99 normal designs. then you just have to go delete some. Next, looking at the file list, next to it is a number, and that number is how many times that file has been run. I tend to leave things that have, if I see a file that's got like 30 runs, I'll leave that because that's a production that someone's doing over and over again. But if I have one cuts, feel free to delete those because you need space on them. Actually, there's something I do want to show folks while some of you are still here. Useful tip. So let's say this design, right? We brought this in and then we set up all the layers. And let's say I wanted to make a bunch of these. So I can select this. Over here on the bottom left-hand side of the tools list, there's a button called Matrix Copy. I can select that and say, oh, I want 4 by 2 and make them 1/10 of an inch apart, and then hit OK. And now I've got multiple of them. If you're going to do many of them, I recommend you follow that path. You bring in one from your software, set it up, and then clone it. If you think, oh, I'll just in Illustrator clone this 100 times and then bring in 100 of them, set up 100 of them, layer by layer. This way, you only set up the layers once and then duplicate everything.
I suppose I am still puzzled about whether or not we can cut acrylic materials.
Yes.
Because it was one of those that is supposedly not to cut it. Yeah, it seems like there are ways to get around it.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, like I have some plexiglass, as I have mentioned to you, 5 millimeter thick. So can this be cut with a laser cutter or not?
So here is the handout that we went over at the beginning.
Yeah.
And plexiglass is in the good side, approved materials. So plexiglass is fine.
How do we know which one is which one? Because here I see polycarbonate and some other ones.
Polycarbonate is not fine. These are the prohibited materials.
Yeah. So first I have to make sure about the material.
So one way that you can tell polycarbonate from acrylic is to do a very small test cut, like a 1/4 inch circle.
Yeah.
1/4 inch square, and watch what happens. Because acrylic will cut nice and cleanly. It has nice, shiny, clear, polished cut edges. Polycarbonate doesn't. Polycarbonate will burn and turn and bubble and give off very thick yellow smoke. That smoke, by the way, is very, very toxic, which is why you only do a very small test cut.
Sure, yeah.
So that's one way. Some people can also which is which by taking a little piece and bending it and seeing whether it turns white as it bends or if it's very brittle. I don't like that because there's a lot of different formulations for these things and they don't all be the same. Some people can, if you scrape the edge with a knife, there's a difference in the way that they sound. You can look up those tricks online.
Yeah, sure. Also, how small of a circle can you cut in assume something that you can't cut?
So the kerf of the laser is, it varies with the thickness of the material and the material itself. On something like 1/4 inch acrylic or 1/8 inch of acrylic, the kerf, I tend to go with about 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters as my kerf.
Oh, I see.
If you think of, oh, I want to cut a 1 millimeter circle, well, you're encroaching by half the kerf on each end, and plus acrylic will weld So if you cut out a circle of acrylic and then let it sit there in the machine, the edges tend to be molten and they stick together and cool. So your pieces tend to
Smaller.
on a big piece, that's not so bad. You can just pop it out. On a very tiny piece, that weld is a significant factor. So on something like acrylic, I wouldn't try to cut a circle less a
Thank you.
Mom is going to give us her Bluetooth headset, and we're just going to man the help desk.
Thank you, James.
Sounds awesome.
I just muted a couple people for some background noise. So if you have a question, make sure you're not muted.
I just wanted to say thanks, and I think you did a really great job of teaching something complicated and
Yeah.
difficult over Zoom. Yeah, I'm really impressed.
I think it's working okay. I definitely would not recommend every tool in the shop to be taught via Zoom. Like
Yeah.
I think some of the wood shop folks and I were talking, you know, you want someone to have a teacher with them the first time they feel what it's like to run a miter saw through a piece of material. But there's very little physical about the laser cutter. So
Yeah.
I think it works well for this.
And I mean, hopefully the first time we go to use it anyway, somebody else will be around and help guide us through the questions. But, you know, it was really helpful to figure out what kind of art can you use and get people imagining like, what might I want to do with this? And yeah, it's really great.
Since some of you are still here and I'm still sharing, I will share in this file, there's a couple of URLs. The first is Cut Laser Cut. This is a site where if, say, you don't have access to a laser cutter, you can send them a file and pick a material and they will laser cut that file out of that material. But because you're doing it sight unseen, every material they offer, they've got this database of what does it look like when you cut it? How much of, like how thin can you leave behind this? In this acrylic, they've left behind 0.5 millimeter between cuts and it's still solid, you know? Where if you were to go look at something like Zote foam and see what 0.5 millimeter left behind looks like, it doesn't work. So if you're curious about what would be a good material for this project, you can come to Cut Laser Cut and look through their library of materials.
Well, that's interesting about that foam. What was that called? Zota foam? Because I remember one of the materials that it sounded like we wouldn't typically be using was foam, you know, a softer foam.
So that is correct. Most of these foams are not good for laser cutting. And in fact, this is a commercial product that is specifically marketed for laser cutters. And even with that, you can see it's not the best result.
Yeah.
But you're normally not going for detail here. Normally when you're cutting this stuff, what you're doing is making custom storage cases like, oh, I want all my camera lenses just so, and I want them protected. So I could take photos of all my lenses, take them into Inkscape, vectorize the outlines, cut them out of Zote foam and put it in a Pelican case.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, this stuff is extremely expensive.
Okay.
It also gives you, you know, description. What's the cut edge like? What is it? Does it have a bad odor? This is a very handy site. The other one is makercase.com. And MakerCase lets you, so a very common usage for laser cutters is custom enclosures or boxes. MakerCase lets you plug in some numbers, pick whether they're inside or outside dimensions, how thick is your material, what kind of joints do you want? So for instance, finger joints, and I want my finger joints to be a little more dense. And then you click download plans and it gives you an SVG that you can pull into Inkscape and manipulate.
Wow.
So MakerCase, very handy. You can also change it to T-slots. What T-slots let you do is put a bolt through here and a captive nut so you can bolt your pieces together. It's pretty common for things like acrylic, though I will say this is not the best design for T-slots because there's no dog bone in the corners. Acrylic is very brittle, and all of these corners are stress risers. If you're designing something like this to be important, what you'll do is come add tiny little circles to all the corners so there's no sharp point. Any other questions?
What's the best way to some of these acrylics, if you don't like make a box of them, if you don't worry about being a sealed box? Is that to keep them? I think I mentioned to you, is that possible to put some screws together and some bends and keep it together like that?
So, well, that would be what the T-slots are for. So let me share real quick. So let's say that you just cut flat panels, right? You're going to screw this together.
Yeah.
And let's say that this is 5 millimeters. What is 5 millimeters? That's 0.5 inches?
About a quarter, yeah.
Quarter of an inch.
Yeah, quarter.
Yeah, just shy of a quarter, yeah. All right, so, and this is only a 4-inch box, so keep in mind the scale that we're talking about. Let's make this 12 by.
Sure.
So we can get a better look of scale.
Yeah.
If you're talking about driving a screw down through here, through this piece and into this edge, then all of the force of that screw is pressing this way and this way. And if this is 5 millimeters and your screw is 2.5 millimeters thick, then that leaves 3/4 of a millimeter here and 3/4, well, that ain't right. 1.5 millimeters here and 1.5 millimeters, or 125 and 125. So all of that binding force is pressing against just over 1 millimeter of acrylic that way.
Yeah.
Way. Your acrylic's just going to split. It won't even split. It'll just fracture along fracture lines here. So that's why I don't recommend screwing directly into acrylic. What the T-slot does is it lets you put a little nut here in this little cutout and then drive a bolt down through that nut. So instead of a shear force on the acrylic, you're putting it into a compressive force.
Compression, right.
And then there's other things you can do with this. You can change how long the bolts are. So I probably wouldn't go with a 1/2 inch on 1/4 inch acrylic. I'd probably go something closer to 5/8 or 3/4 because that gives you more meat here on this edge.
Sure, yeah.
I will say it is kind of tricky to get these captive bolts in place. What I find is handy is to use a little piece of duct tape. So just stick the duct tape to the side of the bolt and then hold that into the little slot while you drive the bolt. Or put the duct tape on the nut, not the bolt. Any other questions?
James, I have an application kind of question. I mean, some people that use this might be like engineering people, and they already have some particular application they're pretty interested in. But I know you can Google anything, of course, but I'm kind of curious, like, wow, I wonder what all I can do with this. Like I went to a fashion show and they had this cool display. It was like these gigantic 15-inch across flowers, I think, that were cut out of paper, and somebody made them 3D, probably cut them on a laser cutter. Anyway, like, would you have any suggested websites that people might go to look at for like ideas of what you could do with this?
So there's, let's see if I can remember this off the top of my head. I just gave them a bunch of money, so let's. So here's a company called Make CNC. All they do are, let's see, browse store, CNC laser patterns. And let's see, aircraft. So here are laser patterns you can buy of just things. And the interesting thing about this is, so sometimes it's hard to make the mental leap because everything you do on the laser cutter when you're cutting it is 2D. So, you know, when people get into CNC at a makerspace, they tend to go one of two ways, the laser cutter or 3D printers. To me, the laser cutter is easier because you're designing in 2D. And to me, 2D design is inherently simpler than 3D design. But that doesn't mean you can't 3D objects with a laser cutter. You just have to think about it differently. So going to a place like this that actually sells patterns, you know, as long as you're not outright trying to copy their pattern, but if you just, what's that? Sorry, I thought someone said something. This is a good place. There's also Thingiverse. Now, Thingiverse started as a place for people to share 3D printing files. So most of the stuff on here is for 3D printers. But if you go up to their search box and just search for laser cut, you'll find a lot of laser cutting patterns. You know, here's some dice boxes, interesting artwork. These are really popular. This is, I think, is actually a good place for people to get started. These are just little votive candle holders, lamps. And they're good because all you do is start with a box, go to somewhere like Box Maker or Maker Case, make a box, and take that SVG and start making it your own. You know, do whatever you want to with it. And these files, as opposed to something like Maker Case, these you can just download and make. That's why they're here, is to share them so people can use them. This is nice enough to even include a link to an Instructable to teach you how they did it, how you can make your own, how to actually go about cutting and gluing them. So sites like Thingiverse are also a good place for inspiration.
Yeah.
Also, in a pinch, handy for homemade Christmas presents. Now that is very interesting because that is my design.
Oh, and somebody else spotted it somewhere?
I don't know. Okay. So,
Okay. Thank you.
any other questions?
No question, James, but I guess to anybody out there, for your reference, I had struggled like 3 times to get the RD, prior to this meeting, to get the RDCam to work on my computer. And it was like it was always looking for something to be connected to the USB. And I mentioned that. And then while you were talking, I loaded RDWorks and it worked first shot right off the bat. So I guess if anybody struggles with getting one of those packages to work, just try a different one. Because I thought I was just doing something stupid because I tried and tried and tried to get it to work and it didn't. And then I tried a different version and it worked fine and I could follow you along just perfect. So
The version that's on our wiki is one that I know works. This is pointing to. I will. One thing about version, this is 8.2.
Thank you very much.
The file types between different versions of this software can be incompatible. So always make sure you have a backup somewhere, just in case you try using it in a different version of the software and it gets corrupted.
very good.
Any other questions? All right then. Actually, one last thing, and I know some folks have left, so I'll post this in the Slack channel later. I will just pick this up. On the wall in the laser cutter area is this piece of wood. This has the Wi-Fi info for the shop, so you can connect to Wi-Fi if you need to, but it also has a link to our scheduling calendar for the laser cutter. You do need to schedule time on the laser cutter to use it. Technically, you don't need to, but if you don't and someone else does, they are allowed to ask you to leave when they get here. So it's in your best interest to schedule time. All right. One more call for questions. If not, we'll wrap it up and call it a night. Any questions? Then I hope you all have a very good night, and thank you for attending the class.
Thank you, James.
Yep.
That was great.
Thanks, James.
We'll hope to see you down there. Well, James, I have a question.